Leaves from a Russian Diary. Pitirim Sorokin. Part 1. 1917. Chapter 2. Next day. February 28, 1917.
This morning, with two friends, I started on foot for the Duma. The streets were full of excited people. All shops were closed, all business suspended. The sound of firing was heard from several directions. Motor cars full of soldiers and young men with rifles and machine guns rushed up and down. They were searching for police and counter-revolutionaries said to be concealed in private houses ready to sally forth and suppress the revolt. From time men and soldiers surrounded a house firing into the windows. Dangerous as they were, they made me think of nothing so much as a gang of boys in a spirit of malicious mischief bent on destruction. I saw no hidden police taken by them, but I did see many dwellers in these unhappy houses, some of them wounded. I also perceived that incendiary fires were more numerous than they had been the night before. On the corner of Barmaliva Street and the Bolshoi Prospect we came upon a group of men pitilessly beating a policeman with butts of revolvers and with heavy boot heels. Almost dead, the wretched victim lay bloody and senseless on the pavement while blows rained on his head and body.
"Stop that, you brutes!"
cried my companion.
"Arrest the man if you like, but don't kill him. Who are you to hinder us from killing a pharaoh?"
They yelled.
"Are you also a counter-revolutionary?"
With the assistance of passers-by we forced these hooligans to release their victim and to leave the street.
"This is promising,"
said my friend indignantly. "Alas, it may be only a presage of what is to follow," I answered, all my doubts returning. As we passed on, the most disquieting rumors reached our ears. Many military regiments in Petrograd and the suburbs were in a state of mutiny. However, the Petropavlovskaya fortress, Peter and Paul, the Admiralty, and the headquarters of the governor of Petrograd were still in the hands of the Tsarist government, and only a portion of the city was dominated by the mob. What was going on outside Petrograd, in the army, in Moscow and the country, no one seemed to know. But no one doubted that the whole empire would join the revolution. Everywhere speeding motor cars. Everywhere hustling crowds mad with excitement. Everywhere the smell of burning buildings and the spectacle of soldiers and workmen searching out police and counter-revolutionists. Before a house on the Neva, not far from the Winter Palace, a more than usually turbulent crowd had gathered. "What's happening here?"
"They are searching the house of a reactionary general,"
voices screamed at us. At the moment a window on the fourth floor of the house smashed outward and a man, hurled forth by the hands of soldiers, fell to the street below, his piercing shriek of agony almost drowned in the exultant cries of the crowd. As the body crashed on the stones, men rushed forward stamping on it, lashing it with whatever they held in their hands. Deathly sick with the hideousness of the sight I ran on, my companion following. The nearer we approached the Duma the denser the crowds became, the more numerous red posters and red flags, hailing the revolution. Suddenly two desperate hands grasped my arm.
"Sorokin, I know you are generous. Save me. In the name of God, save me."
In this man I recognized a spy of the Secret Service who, 2 years before, had denounced and had me arrested. "Go home quickly," I said. "Destroy your uniform, and then, if you can, change your lodgings. If anything happens, let me know." That was all I could do for him.
"Here they come. Here they come. They are led. They are led."
And following the pointing hands of the crowd I saw one of the ministers of the Tsar, accompanied by a squad of soldiers and preceded by Kerensky's slight figure.
At last. At last. Long life to the revolution, and death to all enemies of the people.
100 bloodthirsty hands were flung out to seize the unhappy official.
"In the name of the revolution I forbid you to touch this man,"
cried Kerensky.
"It is not for you to judge him. He and all the others will be tried, and I swear to you that they will receive justice."
These words alone saved the minister from being torn limb from limb.
"Long live Kerensky!"
cried the fickle mob. It was true, as he had told them, ministers and officials of the court were being arrested and hurried to the Duma. Nothing short of this arrest and segregation would have saved any of them that day. Today the hall of the Duma presented quite a different picture from yesterday. Soldiers, workmen, students, citizens, men and women, young and old crowded the place. Order, cleanliness, and restraint were conspicuous by their absence. His Majesty, the people, was master of the scene. In every room and corner were extemporaneous meetings and much loud oratory.
Down with the Tsar. Death to all enemies of the people. Long life to revolution and the democratic republic.
One grew tired of their endless repetition. Today the existence of two centers of power was apparent. One center was the executive committee of the Duma with Rodzianko as its leader, the other was the Soviet of Workmen and Soldiers, sitting at the opposite end of the Russian parliament, with the Social Democrat Chkidze as chairman and Kerensky as vice-chairman. Kerensky served as a connecting link between the two centers. With a group of my workmen students I entered the Soviet room. Instead of the original 12 there were now present 300 or 400 men. It seems that anyone who aspires can become a member of this body. A very informal election, indeed. In the overcrowded room, full of tobacco smoke, wild harangues were being delivered, more than one at a time. In vain the chairman, Chkidze, rang his bell, trying at the top of his voice to call the delegates to order. No one paid the slightest attention. Speakers interrupted each other, scores of independent motions were made. The dominant question which was being discussed as we came in was whether or not Rodzianko, president of the Duma, should be arrested as a counter-revolutionary. I was astounded. Had these people overnight lost their minds? I asked for a chance to speak and was recognized by the chairman. In spite of this fact I found it impossible to make myself heard, partly because, at this moment, an intense firing broke out almost at the doors of the Duma. The Tsarist army is attacking the Duma, ran through the room, and instantly this belligerent assembly became a prey to wildest panic. The delegates took to their heels, jostling each other roughly in the mad desire to escape. In the rush they jammed and almost completely blocked the doorways. Throughout the building the panic spread, and for a few minutes the pandemonium was indescribable. Almost abruptly the firing ceased, and voices rose.
No attack. No Tsarist army. Misunderstanding.
Whereat the deputies bravely began to return to the Soviet room. You foolish men, I addressed them, while not even all Petrograd is in the hands of the revolution till panic reveals its weakness and your own. The revolution is only beginning, and if it is to succeed we must have complete union and accord of all anti-Tsarist forces. There must be no anarchy. In this hour of peril you, a small group of men, debating such a question as the arrest of Rodzianko, are simply wasting time. Can't you see that you yourselves are the revolution? If you persist in following this petty political program, you will inevitably bring disaster on Russia, the Russian people, and on your own selves. I demand that these minor considerations be dropped at once. Maxim Gorky followed me, speaking in the same strain, and for the moment the question of Rodzianko's arrest was put aside. However, it was only too plain that mob mind was beginning to show itself and that not only the beast but the fool in man was striving to get the upper hand. Meanwhile further news reached us. Rodzianko was advocating a new government responsible to the Tsar and to the Duma. The Tsar, we heard, was returning to Petrograd. At the same time we heard that the revolutionary movement had broken out with violence in Moscow. General Ivanov was on his way to the capital with Cossacks to restore order. Guchkov, Shulgin, and other deputies were demanding the abdication of Nicholas in favor of the Tsarovich, and railroad workers had refused to allow the Tsar's train to return to Petrograd. On the way to the room where the executive committee of the Duma was sitting I met one of its members, Mr. Efremov, and learned from him that the struggle between the committee and the Soviet had begun in earnest, and that a dual power was now contending for control of the revolution. Mr. Efremov, greatly agitated, feared that the efforts of the Duma to reach an agreement with the Soviet were hopeless. He foresaw the substitution of responsible government by the mob.
But what can we do?
He asked despairingly. Who is acting in the name of the Soviet?
Sukhanov, Nakamkis, Chkidze and a few others.
He answered. Is it not possible to order soldiers to arrest these men and to disperse the Soviet? I asked, at the same time knowing the proposition to be a rash one.
Such aggression and conflict cannot take place in the first days of the revolution,
was the reply. Then get ready for your own dismissal very soon, I warned him. Were I a member of your committee, I would act immediately. The Duma is still the highest authority in Russia. At this moment Professor Gronsky joined us.
Can you write the proclamation of the future government?
He asked me. Why should I do it? Nabokov is a specialist in such matters. Go to him. In the midst of our conversation an officer burst into the room demanding to be conducted to the committee of the Duma. What has happened? We asked.
All the officers of the Baltic Fleet are being murdered by soldiers and sailors,
he cried, his face pallid with excitement.
The committee must interfere.
My heart turned to ice. It was madness to expect a revolution without some bloodshed, yet as the officer hurried on to the committee, which would doubtless do its best to save the human life, what would its best amount to? Mastering my fears, I made 2 speeches to the crowds outside, praising liberty and the revolution. After that I returned to the Duma. Participating in a conference of the Committee of Supplies, of which I was a member, I learned that markets were being plundered wholesale by the people. Very late at night I reached home. No joy was in my soul, yet I bade myself hope. Tomorrow things might be better. Tomorrow things were not better. In the streets the same unruly crowds, the same motor cars with men firing wildly, the same manhunt of policemen and counter-revolutionaries. In the Duma we received definite news that the Tsar was to abdicate in favor of the Tsarevich Alexis. Today was issued the first copy of a new newspaper, Izvestia. The Soviet has grown to 400 or 500 members. The committee of the Duma and the Soviet are organizing the provisional government, Kerensky acting as a mediator and a liaison between the two bodies. He is vice president of the Soviet and minister of justice. I met him. He was exhausted.
Please write and send a telegram to the governors of prisons throughout Russia to liberate all political prisoners.
If you think best, I assented. The telegram written he signed it, Minister of Justice, Citizen Kerensky. This citizen is new, a little theatrical, but perhaps appropriate. I am not sure how strong will prove Kerensky's mediating powers, and I fear that this dual rule of the provisional, or visionary, government and the extremists of the Soviet cannot last long. One will certainly swallow the other. Which? Certainly the Soviet, representatives of the people, is too weak, its members shrink in fear from any coercion or violence. Well, perhaps they are right. Among others in the Duma I heard Miliakov speak, proposing a constitutional monarchy with Grand Duke Michael as Tsar. The mob heard the proposal coldly. Monarchy has fallen. The mind of the people has become solidly republican. Even a simple bourgeois republic is not radical enough for many. Socialism is demanded. I fear these extremists. I fear mob mind. Frightful news. The massacre of officers increases. In Kronstadt Admiral Wyrin and many other officers of the fleet have been killed. They say that officers are being murdered according to lists prepared by the Germans. I do not know if this is true, but the murder of many of one's best officers is a fact. What will happen if this horror continues? It may lead to the complete demoralization of our forces and the invasion of the country by the Germans. What I observe now in the soldiers in Petrograd, their manners, the expression of their faces, does not please me. Something distinctly menacing is reflected in their behavior. I have just read Order No. 1, issued by the Soviet and in essence authorizing disobedience of soldiers to the orders of their officers. What madman wrote and published this thing? In the library of the Duma I met, among others, Mr. Nabokov, who showed me his draft of the proclamation of the provisional government. All liberties, all guarantees are promised, not only to citizens but to soldiers. Russia is to be one of the most democratic countries and the freest in all the world.
What do you think of it?
He asked proudly. It's an admirable document, but
what?
I fear it is a little too inclusive in time of revolution, in the midst of a world war, I was forced to admit.
I have some apprehensions too.
He said.
But I hope it will be all right.
I can only echo your hope.
Now I am about to write a declaration of the abolition of capital punishment,
said Nabokov. What? Even in the army, in wartime?
Yes.
But this is madness,
cried one man present.
Only lunatics would think of such a thing in this hour when officers are daily butchered like sheep. I hate Tsarism as much as any man, but I am sorry that at this precise time it had to fall. In its way it knew how to govern better than all these visionary fools.
In spite of myself I felt he was right. The old regime has undoubtedly perished. In both Petrograd and Moscow the populace is as joyful as at Easter. Everyone acclaims the new regime and the republic. Liberty, holy liberty, is everywhere shouted and sung. Wonderful revolution. Revolution without blood, pure as the robes of sinless angels. I have heard this last from crowds of students parading the streets. It is all quite true, of course. Bloodshed has not been very terrible. If there are no further victims of the fanatics, our revolution may yet go down to history as the bloodless revolution. Long live the bloodless revolution!